Hey there YouTube, Travis here. So today we are doing a wiring job on this 1978 Honda Hobbit. If you're not familiar with this bike, I picked this up last fall. This was a project of someone's from about 8 years ago. It had been sitting for a long time. I don't think they ever got it running properly. There is some evidence that they got it running at one point, but not for very long. The piston is new and it really looks new with just mild carbon buildup. But anyway, I'm doing wiring on this today. When I got this bike, almost every single wire had been replaced with a black wire, and it had also been soldered together externally. It was really ugly. It wasn't great. The wires were all over the place, through the variator, through the top of the engine, the bottom. It just wasn't great. So I'm stripping everything down and redoing it. And specifically what I'm doing is I'm going to wire it just for spark first, and then we're going to slowly add in some components. This bike was missing a lot of pieces, so we're not going to be doing things like the traditional headlight bucket, which had a key ignition on it. It would have a high beam bulb, indicator light that it was on. It has so much. Actually, Hobbits have quite a bit of wiring, maybe second only to a Tomos A55 in terms of just copious amounts of wiring. But we're working with what we have today. I'm going to do a pretty typical hardwire on this. Not too dissimilar to the way I would hardwire a Puch Maxi. That's just a bare bones daily commuter. But I thought this would be a good opportunity to make a video, show some of my thought process, and point out some tips for doing this yourself too. So one of the first things I'll do is I'll study a wiring diagram off of the Moped Army Wiki or some other site. Usually these are scans of factory manuals. And I'll try and replicate my own with pen and paper. It helps me as I'm going along just so I can remember exactly what I'm doing. So in this case, I've gotten rid of nearly all of this black wire. There's a little bit left here. And we're just starting with our 4 bare wires. 1, 2, 3, 4 in my hand here that come out of the stator. So these come right out of the stator, and 3 of these have power and 1 does not. But what do they really all do? So on a Hobbit, you have yellow, green, red, and black. And if we're looking at just wiring for spark, we're going to play with the black wire first. The other ones I've kind of labeled here what they do. This isn't like a perfect diagram. There's some things missing, but again, we're doing a hard wire here. But black goes to a yellow-black wire. So our black wire off of the stator here comes to our yellow-black wire, and this goes into the rectifier. So this is kind of similar to a Puch, where we're going to be going to the coil. We really are. But first, we pass through this rectifier. So the reason for this rectifier, I would not recommend deleting this. This normally lives under the gas tank. There's a clamp for it here, and this kind of goes like this. I think. I got to reassemble and check. But this rectifier converts the AC coming off the stator to DC. And there's a lot of debates online over like how it's actually done and if it's real DC. What this does is it takes off half of the waves, and you go from alternating current to direct current, whether it's pure direct current or not. I'm not smart enough to debate that, but coming off of this are 2 wires. So you'll notice we have a green, which again, we're working with a Japanese bike here. So green is ground, and then we have a black-white up here. Sorry, my camera's not in the best position. So we have black-white here, which of course comes around and comes in here. So this is your power. It's power for your high tension coil. The high tension coil grounds through the subframe, and then the wire comes out here and it goes to the spark plug. Also worth mentioning, we have our condenser up here, which also receives power from the black-white wire. So we have no kill switch here, nothing, no lights. This would just be for spark only. So we're going to do that here in just a second and see what we get. I'm going to do a quick detour here and show this wiring on a Puch E50. Also, I know a lot of viewers of this channel traditionally have been Puch moped owners. So very similar here. there's no rectifier on a POOC, but this is your blue wire coming from your stator. What we're going to do, and you'll see in the rest of this video, I'm using bullet connectors, but it's the exact same thing if we're working with a screw type terminal like this. You would just use pieces of it and jam more than one wire into the terminal. But anyway, blue wire for power. All this is going to do, we're going to switch to another wire. If I had more blue wire, I would use it, but this is purple. This wire provides power to your high tension coil. This doesn't necessarily ground to the frame, so we have a brown ground wire to the frame, and then you have your spark plug wire to your spark plug. I have an external condenser on this from the factory. They do not have this. It's buried in the stator, so you can ignore this, but this also receives power from this blue wire. And we're going to take the rest of these wires, every single one of them, on a POOC. Your yellow is usually your headlights, your gray is your running light, and the others that power your things like your brake lights. Take all of these and take them to a common ground. So jam multiple wires in there and take them to a common ground, because we're just doing this to test for spark only. You're definitely going to do this with the Hobbit as well. You're going to take those 3 other wires and you're going to ground those 2. So what we have right here, technically it's actually 4 wires, but we have the 3 wires that are not going to the high tension coil, the yellow, the red, and of course the green, and then we have the ground for the rectifier itself. I have these going into these 2 junctions, which are just grounding into the frame right here. You could very easily also use something like one of these wires that has 2 alligator clips on either side that you get at like an auto parts store or like a tool store. You could easily just have those going as a temporary ground. I went ahead and made this a little bit easier to follow. We've got our other wires grounded, we've got power to our coil, and now we're going to put a power drill on the nut for the flywheel. We're going to spin it, see if we have spark. If you don't have a drill, if this bike had a belt on it too, you could also have someone pedal this over and turn the engine over to check for spark. That's usually how it's done, but no belt on this yet, so we're gonna use the drill and see if we have spark. And real quick, before we do the spark test, we're gonna make sure that this ground is good. So I have a probe from my multimeter here. Even the most basic multimeter will have a continuity test. It looks kind of like a little Wi-Fi symbol. And whenever we cross the probes, we get a beep from the multimeter. So we'll test this on other parts of the frame. So we'll come down here to the engine case. We have continuity, so we know that this ground is not obstructed by rubber or paint anywhere. We'll go ahead and look at our subframe down here. Testing on that unpainted piece of metal right there. Sometimes you'll be doing a test and doesn't come off that good. Well, that's because this bolt back here is pretty loose, so you gotta make sure your bolt is nice and tight. But now that we have a confirmed good ground, let's take the bike back outside and we'll go ahead and do that spark test. Now you'll want to use a drill for this, not an impact driver, because that just spins differently and it's the way it delivers power. A drill is going to be consistent turning of this. So we're going to apply our drill. I'm going to put our plug here, making sure we're not touching the metal part of the plug. Hopefully that's coming out on camera. So we have spark. Now that we've confirmed we have spark, we can go on to adding in other components. If we didn't have spark, you'd have to go through the troubleshooting process, looking at your ignition points, making sure they're clean and gapped correctly, timing is set properly, and then the other components in the system. So your high tension coil, condenser, spark plug, boot and wire, and of course the spark plug itself. Those are probably topics best for a different video. Let's go ahead and start looking at adding in things like a kill switch and some lights. So let's take another look back at the diagram we're making. So if we want to put in a kill switch, which we'll do next, we're going to put that into the white black that comes in between the rectifier and the power to the high tension coil. Normally on a factory wiring, it would go to both the kill switch at the handlebars as well as the keyed ignition kill switch. We don't have that headlight assembly, so we're going to ignore that and just have the kill switch at the handlebars, which when you flick that switch, it connects to the ground wire. So you could either have it wired up at the handlebars or connect to the common ground down where we're doing all that wiring in between the seat and gas tank. It grounds, thus the high tension coil is grounded and you lose spark and the bike shuts off. So let's take a look at the bike. We're lucky with this bike that there is some factory wiring left. There's a little bit for this factory kill switch right here. It goes through the handlebars, another Honda Hobbit thing, and it comes out here with this wiring cluster on the left. And there's been some splices from the previous owner here where it switches to black wires for just a second, but then I wired in some existing cable that came off of another Honda Hobbit parts bike. And so we actually do have the correct green for ground and then black-white for power. So we're going to come down here. We're going to come back to our common grounds. We're going to plug in a green ground here into our common grounds. And then I went ahead for the wire going out to the high tension coil. We can now also plug in there. I went ahead and put in a two box end on there. So now, whenever we flick the switch to off, it completes the circuit, and thus the coil down there, the power wire going to it, will be grounded out. So we can do this same continuity test with this switch. So right now the switch is in the run position. So as it's running, we aren't grounding out the high tension coil, thus the bike will have spark. When we switch off on the kill switch, we have continuity. So we know that the circuit is complete when the switch is flicked to off. So let's work on our lights now. So the easiest light to wire is going to be the headlight. So with the headlight, from the yellow wire from the stator, we'll come up. We'll have our headlight bulb itself, HL for headlight, and then this headlight can either come back down to the common ground that's below the seat, or a lot of people do is they'll simply just have a wire and have that connect up at the handlebars to a guaranteed good ground. So not a common ground, but just a good ground to complete that circuit. That's the simplest solution. People will also do this with the kill switch too. In the previous example, that wire ran back down to the common ground, but sometimes you'll have a situation where you're riding someone else's bike and they literally have the ground wire just hanging, and that's the kill wire. So when you touch that to like the handlebars or another metal part of the bike, it'll shut off. That's not the safest way to do it. So we had that come back down to the common ground. Now, the next thing we're gonna wanna wire in, coming right off the same yellow wire from the stator, before it goes up to the handlebars to the headlight, we are gonna go ahead and connect the brown wire for the taillight. That taillight wire then returns on a green ground to our common ground under the seat. So we're just going to keep that running light right there like that. And then really the last piece of this puzzle is our brake light wiring. So from the factory, the red wire from the stator, it says ignition in the factory wiring diagram. And there's really 4 wires that are in play here. And I actually have factory headlight bucket, which still has the key ignition in the back of it. If we look on the inside, we do see there are 4 wires. This red would come from the stator to the ignition. There are 2 wires in here which we're going to ignore. So we have our black-white and our green for our common ground. Because we are not using a keyed ignition, we can totally ignore these. the function of these two wires in a factory configuration would be wired up the exact same way as the kill switch up here, where it grounds out the power wire to the high tension cable. And really what happens is when we go power in here, this black wire, so not the black white wire, but the pure black wire that comes out, this is a hot wire, it's a power wire. And from here, this powers both brake light switches, and then if the circuit's open, the brake light. And it also powers the horn as well. There's no horn in this rewire. In my personal opinion, you can yell louder than the horn on a stock moped. So no horn on this rewire, but we are going to be powering the brake light switches with this. So our red wire goes to the brake light switches for power, and on the factory configuration and by happenstance in this hard wire, it's going to switch to a black wire. So black wire at the switches, then green-yellow, a green/yellow stripe wire comes down. We're going to join it into one because squeezing either of the brake levers should cause that taillight to come on. And then finally, the same common ground as the running light, which is already returning here. So there's a one green ground wire for both the brake light and the tail light. Let's take a look at what that actually looks like. All right, so from the top, this wiring, it is ugly. It's not cleaned up yet, but it's easiest to look at and follow and describe when it's like this. This is the complete hard wire for a 1978 Honda Hobbit. The wiring varied a little bit year over year, so there's some wires that aren't going to be applicable here to later years. And this is for points, not a CDI model, which is also pretty different. But let's follow these wires one at a time. So the real important wire for powering Spark is your black wire here, which goes to a yellow-black wire, which is permanently connected to the rectifier, which normally lives right here. The rectifier then comes to an output, which has a split, but the main connection in the back goes to the high tension coil. It powers the high tension coil, the condenser, and then goes through the spark plug wire to the spark plug. These two lines that feed off it, one of course is the hot wire from the rectifier, and then the second one is your kill switch. So this goes all the way up to the handlebars, it comes to the switch, and then there's when the switch is set to run, it's open, but if we close it, it completes the circuit and goes into your common ground. So that comes all the way down here into one of these four wires that go to the ground. That's one stator wire. The second one we'll look at is the yellow. The yellow is for the headlight and the running light. So out of the stator, we have a yellow light. And if you wanted to put a voltage regulator into this configuration, you'd put it in here. At this point, I'm going to run this with regular bulbs and see where I get. But if you wanted to put like a Trail Tech dial-up brightness voltage regulator, you'd run it into this wire. We go to two places. First, we go, if we follow it straight, this yellow wire up to the headlight bucket. And you can look inside the headlight bucket assembly and see which wire goes from the base of the bulb out to the back, which is this one. Then you have your ground, which I am just doing a very simple ground here on the headlight, or the fork ears next to the headlight. This will probably get cleaned up, possibly even relocated as a wire back to the common ground, but this is fine. For our yellow, we also tie into one of the three wires going to the taillight, the brown wire. The brown wire powers the running light, which is a bulb that is always on when the bike is on. Next, let's look at our red wire. Our red wire powers our brake lights switches and then our brake light. So our red wire is just one connection, goes all the way up. It switches to a black wire, and that would happen with a factory configuration too, and it goes to each switch. Normally, see that little button in there is your brake light switch. When there's a cable in here, it holds tension on it. So normally this is a closed circuit, but when we squeeze the brakes, the switch pops open. The circuit is connected, so then electricity comes back down, and this time when it returns, it's going to return with a green yellow wire. So that wire goes into one. We have our green yellow wire connects to our green yellow wire, which goes to power our brake lights. And then of course it returns on this somewhat lighter green ground back to our common grounds. And finally, the fourth wire is a ground wire. So that goes to our common grounds. And there's another grounding wire for the rectifier that goes to our grounds. And that's it. That is the extent that I'm going to wire this bike. So what's left? This bike doesn't actually run yet. There's some really fishy stuff going on with that top end. So it doesn't actually run yet. But with the power drill, just like we tested for spark, we can also test to see if these lights and this kill switch work. Let's go ahead and test out this headlight. Hopefully this comes out on camera, but let's go ahead and check out our tail light. And our brake light, tail light, brake light, tail light, brake light. So our kill switch is set to run. We have spark, kill switch to off, no spark. So there you have it. There's all of our wiring assembled and tested. Next, I'm going to go over specifically how these wires are connected. We're going to go over how to solder a wire to extend it, and just have a little bit of information here about how I wire things and how you can wire them too at home. So when we're thinking about doing wiring and the actual, like, how do I do wiring, I like to keep it simple. Every bike is different with how they choose to connect wires. Hobbits, this is one of the few remaining factory connections on the bike, use these bullet style terminals. And you actually can't really buy these at your local hardware store or auto parts store. You can buy these, which I'm using here just because that's what I have, these types of bullet connectors, but they're larger. You could probably go deep on the internet and find like a bulk, box of these. But I haven't seen anything easy, and I don't do total wiring jobs from the ground up all that often to necessitate ordering them. So I'm going to use these, and it'll be okay. But for other connections in a pinch, you can find your typical spade-style connectors. Most auto parts stores, hardware stores, tool stores will have a nice thing of these. And honestly, you don't really need these that often. Bikes like a Pook will use a screw type wiring terminal in order to make that connection. And you can also buy other types of screw style terminals as well. There's not an ideal solution when it comes to joining all these wires together in an easy fashion that allows you to disconnect them when you need to service the bike, things like that. So you really work with what you have. These ones are nice. They are a little bit weather protected, or at least they make it seem like they're weather protected. So we're going to be using these. And then I have this electrician's tool. This is a super cheap one. I think I got this at Harbor Freight, and it might have been $5 or $10 tops. But these are so nice. I used to strip wires with kitchen scissors, and it was kind of a mess. Once you get something like this, and it has this nice wire stripper right here, it has a way to cut it. And also, it has this bit up top, which is amazing for crimping these connections. And it's especially nice at crimping these cheap, hard connections back here. because they crimp down and they stay there. And if you don't crimp them down, they're going to fall apart. So this tool is actually great at doing all of those. I use this on my mopeds and in my house. And, you know, I got by before without it, but now I feel really silly for not buying one of these sooner. When it comes to extending wire or joining wires together in a permanent way, we have to do that a lot on this Honda Hobbit rewire. I'm going to be soldering these wires and trying to solder as much as I can. If you're relying on crimp style butt connectors to join all your wiring together, it's just increasing your chance that something's going to vibrate apart. Mopeds, they vibrate and they shake so much. This is a really nice way to do a permanent connection with some soldering and some heat shrink tubing. So let's go ahead and say we were just going to cut this wire here. Now, first we need to expose some of the bare copper inside. So we're going to go work our way down our gauges until we reach the one that is correct. So once we have our wires stripped, you know, in the early days of doing this, I would just wrap these two like this, solder, and then fold over, and then put heat shrink tubing over both of these and call it good. You know, in my mind on a moped, that's okay, but it's not really the best way to solder. And so the way I'm going to solder these two wires is using the kind of the Western Union telegraph splice. So the way you do it, cross them like this, like they're two lightsabers in a duel, and then you go around once. And so what you're left with is this, where one wire points up, one wire points down. And then you can take the one pointing up, and let's go to the right. Let's start wrapping this backwards. So we're going to start going around as much as we can with just this little bit of wire. So we get like 2 turns around. So then we've got our wire that's pointing down. So we're going to go the other way. We're going to start wrapping around the wire the other way. Now what we're left with is a connection that actually on its own is kind of hard to pull apart. Like it stands on its own a little bit, which is cool. If we just twisted them together, we'd be able to pull them apart really easy. So I'm going to solder this now. And one thing worth mentioning is that, you know, we're going to be putting some heat shrink tubing over this at the end. And it's really important that you slide your heat shrink tubing first while the wires are still apart. That way, especially if you're wiring something like to the stator or to a switch that's really hard to take apart, you don't have to worry about not being there ahead of time. So when it comes to soldering, what we're going to do is we're going to tin the wires first. So we're just going to get the wires hot. Hopefully help the solder flow a little easier. And then we're going to take some of our wire. This is rosin core solder. And we're going to start to just kind of coat the tip of the soldering iron with it. And then we're just going to try and roll this. Roll this on our connection. Make it nice and silvery. Try and spread that out as evenly as you can. You don't want big globs of solder if you can help it. So we're going to wipe our soldering tip on our sponge. This really extremely thin sponge that came with this soldering iron. So then we go ahead and slide our heat shrink tubing over everything. Try to get that in the middle. And in my kitchen scissor days, before I had my electrician's tool, I would just hold a Bic lighter under here and watch this heat shrink tubing shrink. But I now own a heat gun. I got it from Harbor Freight. They are not expensive, so I'm going to switch to that. We're going to go ahead and heat that heat shrink tubing down. So we're left with this really nice solid connection. We can pull on it. It's not going anywhere. It's nice and neat. It's going to go through any tubing really nicely if you're using some of that, some sheathing. It doesn't have a big bulge because you folded the wires over. Though again, I did that for a long time, but this is really a really solid connection. Okay there, YouTube. Well, we're going to continue to clean up this wiring. We're going to make things nice and neat, only as long as it needs to be. We're gonna get this wiring cleaned up, put together, going under the gas tank, and then we'll have this wiring live to where if we put the plastic floorboards on like this bike is supposed to have, it would be sitting protected underneath. But this was just a start. This was to make it functional and to show how I would go about hardwiring a bike like this. Doing any other moped, be it a Puch or any other type, wouldn't be all that different. And we've kept most of the factory colors here so that troubleshooting is easy. And if we did need to drop the engine or do something like that, we can pull all these apart and connect color to color and be okay. So I hope you enjoyed this video. This bike still has a ways to come to get it running, but I wanted to share this and the techniques on how I do wiring, again, just as a hobbyist here. Hope you enjoyed the video, everyone. Until next time.